This is a story about hope triumphing over experience. Once again, the Cuban economy appears to be on the brink of collapse in the face of tightening U.S. economic sanctions, this time without the potential for help from the Soviet Union or Venezuela.
We're not investing in Cuba. It would be a loss.
No, para yo vivir en Cuba tiene que ser que el sistema de Cuba se caiga y haya una democracia. Esa es como única puedo vivir en Cuba.
Cuando se caiga el comunismo, volvería a Cuba.
The section of Miami known as Little Havana is home to over half of Cuban Americans whose families fled the Castro Revolution nearly 70 years ago. And even as Havana, 200 miles to their south, struggles, many remain hopeful that things can and must change.
Cuba's in a lot of trouble because, unfortunately for them, it's run by a bunch of incompetent communists. And being communist is bad. Being an incompetent communist is like the worst.
Before the revolution in 1959, Cuba had the third largest GDP per capita in Latin America. Today, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean estimates that the country has the lowest nominal GDP per capita in the region.
Because of the US sanctions, they've just been starved of finance for so long. I think every sector, pretty much every sector, is open to investment.
Emily Morris is a research fellow at University College London. There's a lot of uncertainty about Cuba right now. I won't ask you to predict what will happen, but give me a range of scenarios that might happen.
Okay, well, the first scenario is, I suppose, the intended scenario for the actions that have been taken by the US. You create such a lot of hardship that somehow the population turns against their government, or the government is forced to resign, and then you have a change of regime, and you have a new political system, and then you have the restoration of capitalism. The second scenario is that the US continues to create more and more hardship, and the situation just gets worse and worse in Cuba. The third scenario, if you went in and took out either the president or Raul Castro, who's 95, and then somebody else would step in. And then the fourth scenario is what they refer to as greater military action, which would be to ramp up the pressure by using US military to damage infrastructure and all the rest of it. Again, unlikely to achieve the objectives.
Some who hope for change in the Cuban economy point to President Díaz-Canel's proposed reforms.
Para las formas de gestión no estatal se van a limitar las actividades prohibidas. Hay también un grupo de disposiciones para incentivar la inversión extranjera directa. Tiene que ver con derechos de superficie, quitar trabas, tiene que ver también con el uso de las cuentas bancarias, con los plazos de aprobación de la inversión extranjera directa.
In June, Cuban lawmakers passed 176 sweeping free market reforms, including the expansion of foreign and private investment, the decentralization of Cuba's economy, and liberalization of factors such as tourism, banking, property, and agriculture.
We've had this statement by the Cubans, which is an interesting one, and I think we should take it seriously. But this is an acceleration. It's much more explicit, and it's an invitation to Cuban-Americans to invest in Cuba. It includes privatizations, a wider opening to foreign investment, and the actual withdrawal of the government from central planning system.
En esta coyuntura tan complicada de 2026, pues parece que ese balance ha favorecido a aquellos que se inclinan por reformas de mercado, pero tienen un problema de credibilidad.
Pavel Vidal is a professor at Pontificia Universidad Javariana in Cali, Colombia. He is Cuban-born and worked at Cuba's central bank and the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy until he left the country in 2012.
Hay que ver cómo ellos avanzan en estas reformas para mostrar efectivamente que esto no son reformas transitorias, que no son simples maquillajes o anuncios, sino que tienen una disposición a cambiar la estructura de propiedad, los mecanismos de funcionamiento de la economía, y que el Estado se va a retirar de la economía y le va a dar más espacio a los capitales nacionales, a los capitales internacionales.
But where some see the promise of the announced reforms, others are deeply skeptical. Particularly some Cuban-American investors eager to return to investing in their home country.
They are afraid, as a communist dictatorship, of the entrepreneurial class having actually freedom and actually having essentially an opposition that can challenge their government.
Andro Nadarce Leon is a Cuban-American hotelier whose Lion Grove has substantial real estate investments in the United States.
They're never going to allow for any meaningful amount of private market activity. They're completely lying, and it's a farce. These steps that they're taking with these supposed reforms. They're doing it to buy time. They're doing it because they're trying to run out the clock on the Trump administration and the efforts of President Trump and Secretary Marco Rubio. That's what they're playing for. The Cuban people know it.
We just want them to be a nicely run country. We're going to let our people go back and let them invest in Cuba if they'd like.
Essential to President Trump's plans to open Cuba up to U.S. investment are the heavy sanctions he has imposed, sanctions that have hit the Cuban economy hard, including one of the most promising sectors, tourism. Since May, hotel groups including Melia, Iberostar, Blue Diamond, and Archipelago International have either pulled the plug or curtailed operations. And the number of visits last year were down 62% from the country's peak in 2018, the lowest in 20 years other than during the COVID-19 pandemic.
The offering of services in Cuba is obviously significantly limited by how broken that economy is. And so for many years now, the tourism market in Cuba was not a market that had five-star properties. Upper upscale luxury was not really something that you saw in a significant way in Cuba. It was a lower rated market. The good thing is that there is a significant amount of existing properties there, existing assets, and existing infrastructure within the tourism industry. I think it requires firms like ours going and acquiring those properties, reinvesting and reimagining and upgrading those properties, and also bringing the operating conditions of those properties to a world-class scale. And so that's the lens through which we're looking at investing in Cuba. Surely there will also be the development of brand new resorts. I think there will be an opportunity for the development of branded residential product, right, which often is joined together with resorts or other types of hospitality properties. And so we think the future is very bright in that sector, without a doubt, and it's a very important pillar of the economic recovery of the island.
Turismo parece ser un sector, al menos en un inicio, que puede generar oportunidades, sobre todo si hay una flexibilización a las restricciones de viaje de los ciudadanos estadounidenses, ¿no? Que podría ser el mercado natural a partir del cual se genere un boom del arribo de visitantes, como sucedió, por ejemplo, con las flexibilizaciones que se introdujeron en las sanciones y en los viajes durante la administración Obama.
Vidal says at this point, the Cuban government isn't looking to places like Mexico or Chile to inform its economic policies. It most often cites Vietnam or even China.
As Cuba seeks to rebuild its economy, are there lessons it can learn from other Latin American countries?
Sí, bueno, normalmente las referencias que prefiere el gobierno cubano son las referencias a Vietnam y China, ¿no? Sobre todo porque ellos están haciendo cambios económicos y por ahora no han mencionado cambios políticos. Entonces ese modelo de transformación donde se dan los cambios económicos sin cambios políticos, pues es su preferencia. No digo que ese sea el modelo que vaya a sobrevivir. Entonces hay factores que se pondrían obstáculos a esa posibilidad de manejar una reforma al estilo vietnamita y chino sin cambios políticos, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que esa influencia de América Latina, de instituciones democráticas, de un Estado de Derecho, son lecciones que en algún momento tienen que llegar a Cuba.
Cuba is very close to Vietnam. They've had experts coming over. They explicitly say that they're studying or they're following the Vietnamese model but adapting it to the Cuban reality and so on. They're looking for a Vietnam model, a very different kind of economy. The Vietnamese model or economy at the time of the beginning of the transition was very rural. Cuba is a very urban society. It's a very externally dependent economy. So, you know, the conditions are different, but the idea of following a transition path towards a mixed economy is clearly and explicitly stated now by the Cuban government.
But some of those who know best say that for real economic reform, Cuba will need to change its entire political system away from state control.
No está claro cuál es el modelo que quiere seguir esta transformación que se plantea para Cuba. De hecho, ese es un problema, ¿no? Que se anuncian reformas, pero no está claro hacia dónde vamos, y ellos quieren mantener un peso importante de la empresa estatal, ¿no? Un peso importante del Estado interviniendo en la economía, ¿no? Que sería más un modelo de tipo escandinavo, donde se amplían las reformas de mercado, pero se mantiene una intervención importante del Estado regulando todos los procesos económicos, donde, bueno, pues ahí habría un distanciamiento de América Latina.
For Cuban Americans, it's been a long wait to see conditions on the ground change enough to bring them back. There's been hope for some 70 years. And at least so far, the experience has not risen to the level of those hopes. But make no mistake about the appetite to return.
You know, myself, I think the entire Cuban exile community has been dreaming about this day to be able to support our brothers and sisters and see our country be reconstructed and see our country become a beacon of freedom, a beacon of economic prosperity and hope for the entire region.